Dr. Alwi Abdurrahman Shihab, who earned his first PhD from the University of Ain al-Shams in Cairo, in Egypt in 1990. He earned his second PhD from Temple University in the United States in 1995. He was awarded an academic award from the Egyptian government. He was Republic Indonesia's Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1999 to 2001, and the Coordinating Minister for People's Welfare 2004-2005. He has been an active member of various international organizations, such as the International Connection Commitment in the American Academy of Religion in Atlanta, Georgia, USA. He has taught at 3 universities in the United States and is frequently invited to be a visiting lecturer or speaker on Islam in the United States and many other parts of the world. He is currently a member of the University of Indonesia Board of Trustees and the President's Envoy to the Middle East. This is indeed a very distinctive profile, and I look forward to his presentation with us today. May I invite you, please, to start your presentation. Thank you.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man tabi'ahu wa nasarahu wa wala. Distinguished Chairman, Professor Muhammad Hashim Kamali, my friend from Temple University, Professor Datuk Usman Bakar, distinguished participant, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude and thanks to the Institute for inviting me and allowing me to share my views with regard to the topic. In fact, I am not too much involved in academia recently, as I'm the envoy of the President to the Middle East to enhance economic cooperation, but not in the political affairs. But I'm delighted to return to my original habitat, to the academia. And I'm thankful for that opportunity given to me by the Institute. Today we are to discuss global challenges to religious extremism. This has been the topic of the day since 9/11. And up till today, still we are discussing and trying to answer all question raised because of that tragic event. I will begin my presentation today by quoting a number of scholars who had earnestly done an intensive research on matters closely related to our issue. First, Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregation of the British Commonwealth, Professor Jonathan Sacks. He says, religion has returned counterintuitively against all expectation in many parts of the world as a powerful, even shaping force. The presence of religion has been particularly acute in conflict zones such as Bosnia, Kashmir, Northern Ireland, the Middle East, and part of Asia. Religion is often the heart of conflict, and religion is often the fault line along the sides divide. The reason is simple. The 20th century was dominated by the politics of ideology, the 21st century is dominated by the politics of identity. When politics turn from ideology to identity, people inevitably turn to religion, to the great repository of human wisdom on the question, who am I? Second quotation from Carlton Cobb, professor at Harvard Seminary, states, as much as religion inspires peace and goodwill, it also lends itself to violence. This is because that every religion has its heresies, which must be marked and remembered as out of bounds heresies, are children of the religion from whence they come. Richard Niebuhr, the third quotation, with respect to the response to the 9/11 tragedy, this means understanding not only the how and who of what took place, but also the why. It seems that we have failed to show this response by lack of reflection, understanding, and dialogue regarding the reason behind such acts. It requires repentance, a total revolution of our minds and hearts. Repentance includes a willingness to accept some responsibility for a world in which human beings can feel justified in such an act. This is in no way to say that the tragedy of 9/11 is justifiable by any stretch of imagination, but simply to say that the hatred and anger that motivated it have many sources, and perhaps we need to be willing to recognize our culpability for some of them. Prime Minister of Canada addressing the West, stating, "You can't exercise your powers to the point of humiliation for the others." Norman Daniel, in his book Islam and the West, states that the Christian medieval mentality of degrading Islam continues to linger in the minds of the contemporary Westerners. And lastly, and maybe this is going to be a part of our discussion in terms of our region, Max Weber, a great German sociologist, wrote a book which is self-explanatory, titled The Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, meaning that the concept, the doctrine, can shape the attitude and the behavior, societal behavior, in any certain time or in any situation and condition. From all above statements, we can draw some conclusion that we have to draw a clear line and distinction between religion and the religious thought. Sometimes we inaccurately and mistakenly equate religion and religious thought. In the case of Islam, Islam is sacred and not subject to change. Islamic thought covers great varieties of disciplines and sciences as well as school of thought. In other words, Muslim history and thoughts have been the product of a complex interchange between human interpretation and the divine revelation. It is therefore important to note that Islam has given rise to a complex plethora of religious and ideological attitudes and forces that have taken the Quran and the Sunnah as their starting point. Indeed, the impact of 9/11 on the Islamic world was great. On one hand, Muslim world leaders attempted to address the shameful accusation by holding conferences and seminars to explain that the fundamental doctrine of Islam does not in any way teach or even suggest violence On the other hand, the United States government feels the need to explain that the war against terror is not against Islam and Muslim, a sentiment intentionally emphasized in an effort to avoid misunderstanding by the Islamic world toward the US and the West. To date, observers from the West and Islam have attempted to do a thorough and objective study the reason behind why 9/11 occurred. Years after the event, clear and rational thinking was beginning to come forth. The fundamental question, or the remaining puzzle to be solved, is what encouraged the perpetrators, people of sufficient intelligence and finances, to commit their terrorist act. The puzzle appears to be a question concerning the relationship between the religion of the perpetrators, Islam, and the act of terror they committed. This is in the case of what has been spreadly acknowledged, that the perpetrators were Muslim, and most of them are from Saudi Arabia or Arab countries. First, it must be acknowledged that terrorism does not recognize the border of religion, race, nations, and geography. Throughout history, we have been confronted with terrorist acts committed by groups with various backgrounds and motives. Consequently, countries will occasionally launch terrorist acts towards an intended target. It is widely known in our modern history that there are many terrorist groups in various parts of the world. Some of these include the Tamil Tiger in Sri Lanka, Takfir wal Hijrah in Egypt, Bader Meinhof in Germany, the Red Brigades in Italy, the Action Directe in France, the Irish Republican Army in England, Tupac Amaru in Peru, Aung Shinrikyo Kyo in Japan, the Abu Nidal group in Palestine, and Abu Sayyaf group in the Philippines, and lastly, the one that is the focus of our analysis, Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. For the most part, scholars agree that the dominant motivation for acts of terror is revenge, or a reaction due to a sense of injustice felt by a certain group. Though some of the above-named groups are from a certain religion and use their religion as a motivation, or even base their terrorist acts on its teaching, to make the religion itself a target of hate and criticism is a great mistake. No religion, especially not the great religions like Islam, approves or supports the killing of innocent people. In this regard, the Quran explicitly condemned action that caused the loss of life. The Quran states that when a man kills a person, it is as though he kills all people. On another occasion, the Quran also explained that the sanction for someone who creates mischief throughout the land is similar to that given to those who fight against God and His messengers. 9/11 changed many things, especially life in the United States and the West. No previous acts of terror has as wide an impact as 9/11. The collapse of the myth that the US was the only superpower free from terrorism was a terrible surprise that shocked the United States government and the American people. It is only natural that the government and the American people would feel emotionally bitter toward those who do not condemn the act of terror, but actually blame the US and its foreign policies toward Palestine as the reason for the terrorist acts. Much has been said and written about Islam and terrorism, and especially since the tragic event of 9/11. Many have blamed the noble Quran, the sacred book of Islam, for justifying and teaching an ideology of terrorism. I wish to discuss at this juncture the Quranic teaching on war and peace, tolerance and intolerance, crime and retaliatory punishment, and pardon and forgiveness. I do so with the conviction that the Quran is the fundamental source of Muslim law and morality, social interaction and piety. It is as well the primary guide of Muslim to the middle and moderate position between any two extreme, as God says, thus have we made you, Muslim, a community of the middle way, ummatan wasata, in order that you may be witness over the rest of humankind, and that the messenger may be a witness over you. Al-Baqarah 143. With the Quran as our source and guide, we actually return to the basic of Islam on all points of faith, morality, and law. The general message of the Quran is one of hope, faith, and peace for community of over 1 billion people who live by its laws and precepts. It stipulates that peace is to be found through faith in God and justice among all human beings. The very word Islam derived from salam. Salam means peace. The Quran came to a society dominated by vendetta and intertribal warfare. Even now it addresses a world that lives in a continuous state of war and under the threat of a nuclear catastrophe that may destroy all life on this beautiful planet. A careful and objective look at the Quranic teachings would clearly demonstrate that the Quran is in fact against terrorism. It may even be used as a means of combating all kinds of terrorism, but be it individual, group, or state terrorism. It is noteworthy that Islamic law often protected non-Muslims from over-enthusiastic and tyrannical Muslim rulers who sought to impose Islam on others, as happened in Egypt during the Mamluk rule. Needless to say that no Muslim political or religious leaders has either condoned or supported the act of terrorism that have been committed by Muslim extremists, more often than not against fellow Muslims in the name of a distorted Islam. My own country, Indonesia, has been the victim of terrorist acts, such as the Bali bombing and other acts of terrorism. Our government has also been in the forefront in combating terrorism. Indeed, we are puzzled to the tragic event of September 11. Why such terrorist act occurred and perpetrated by individuals claimed to be true Muslim with excessive zeal on Islamic teachings. Let us try to examine this dangerous phenomenon and seek to remedy the wounds with the hope to be able to restore true and bright image of Islam as religion that promote peace and condemn evildoers who perpetuate mischief on earth. The Quran says, the punishment of those who wage war against Allah and His Messenger and strive with might and main for mischief through the land is execution or crucifixion or the cutting of hands and feet from opposite side or exile from the land. This verse puts the nature of crime and evil on equal footing between those who wage war against God and His Messenger and those who perpetuate evil and terror on earth. Through this seminar, I would like to invite us to try to reflect with a clear mind and objectivity the root cause of such dangerous phenomenon encountered by humanity today. Let us seek the real cause in order to find the correct solution for us to live in peace and harmony among nations. No one denies the hostility in the Islamic world against the US and the West has roused in unprecedented way in the wake of the tragic event of September 11. A number of hypotheses have surfaced to explain these attitudes. Many argue that these hostile feelings are an expression of the contradiction in culture and civilization between Islam and the West, the incompatibility between Islam and the West is rooted in the long history of competition and conflict. Such opinion clearly accentuates the Samuel Huntington thesis of the eventual clash of civilization between the East and the West. In my view, there are at least two factors led to the tragic event of 9/11. The first, the external factor. It goes without saying the great impact of the differences in culture and civilization between the two sides, Islam and the West, into the tragedy. Yet what is equally important is the impact of the US policy, Western world policy towards the Islamic world, toward the Muslim, and in particular the US policy on the Arab-Israeli conflict, need to be revisited. Such policies, which viewed by the Islamic world as ambivalent and partial, in favor of the Israelis, not in favor of Palestine, not even objectively balanced, but in favor of the Israelis. This triggers sentiments of hostility and aggravate the feelings of difference in culture and civilization. Today's Islamic radicalism is almost anti-nationalist. Its practitioners dream of uniting the people of an entire Islam, Muslim Ummah. The US is viewed as the prime obstacles holding up government that stand in the path of this transnational Islamic vision. They see the US as providing the means for these regimes they abhor to stay in power. They see these regimes are uncommitted to the pure teaching of Islam. This explains why Osama bin Laden keeps a close link with both the Egyptian Jama'ah Islamiyah and Islamic Jihad groups, intent to eliminating and killing President Hosni Mubarak and successfully assassinated President Anwar Sadat. This is the external factor that trigger hostility, anger, hatred, combined with the long history of conflict between Christian and Muslim starting from the Crusades. What is the internal factor? Which we combine the external and the internal, created something that led to the tragedy of 9/11. At least that is my view. The internal factor, we can conclude the internal factor by saying the implication of the empirical control over the Islamic world by the West is evidently clear when examining Islamic reform movement in the modern Arab world. With the end of the Ottoman Empire, reform movements started to emerge in various parts of the Arab world as a reaction to the acute deterioration of the Ottoman Empire in comparison to Europe's Renaissance. These movements are often known in two broad categories. First, the Salafi, the Puritan, the Wahhabis, known to seek a return to the pure primary teachings of Islam and refuse to submit to the Western culture. Very noble concept. Return to the purity of Islam, as we find in the Christian Puritans. If you happen to go to Pennsylvania, you will find the Amish group. They are Puritan. They don't harm people, but they keep the purity of Christianity, even their clothes, even their daily interaction. So motivated by noble intention. The Wahhabi reformists motivated by noble intention. They do not like to see alien culture or intrusion to the Islamic teaching. So that was the original motivation of the emergence or the birth of Wahhabism, founded by Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. This is the first version of the reformist movement or group. The second, modern Islamic movement, seek to merge Islam and European civilization. Because European civilization, like democracy, let's say, is compatible to Islamic teaching. In other words, it seeks to make compromises between Islam and European modernization and not to reject it altogether. The most notable proponents of this movement are Jamaluddin al-Afghani and Sheikh Muhammad Abdu of Egypt. Both of these movements, the first, the Wahhabi movement, and the more moderate movement, sought to purify Islamic thought from all aspects of weakness and deterioration. However, the Wahhabi movement took a stringent course in its vision and mission. The Wahhabi is a Sunni puritanical movement founded by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, 1703-1791. It rejects all religious practices adopted after the 3rd century of the Muslim era, such as philosophy. So for them, there is no such thing as Islamic philosophy. Sufism and Shiism, Shiite, and local practices, even which are embodied with Islamic spirit, are rejected and branded heretic. The excessive ceremony of the birth of the Prophet, Maulid, is seen by them as an innovative ritual which has to be rejected. This movement familiarized the term bid'ah or innovation, religious innovation. And this is considered by them as an act of misguiding and thus contrary to the purity of Islam. The House of Saud, the royal family of Saudi Arabia, formed a pact with Imam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in 1744 and began their conquer of Arabia 20 years ago. So in Saudi Arabia today you have two elites. One is religious elites, derive their teachings from Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and you have the political elites by the royal family, not too much involved in religious affairs. A 14th century firebrand, a sharp-tongued, notable scholar by the name of Imam Ibn Taymiyyah, is the prime source of the ideological inspiration of this movement. When you ask what is the ideological inspiration of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, always people know that there was a notable scholar, sharp-tongued scholar by the name of Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah, out of his sincerity to Islam and with high noble intention, sought to cleanse Islam from the stain and contamination of alien culture, which for him constitute a real threat to Islam and Muslims. He is known to be critical to philosophy, to Sufism and Shiism, as well as to Christianity. One of his books entitled Al-Jawab al-Sahih Liman Baddala Din al-Masih, the correct response to those who alter the religion of Christ, He is prolific writer and the product of his environment in which hostility was in its height between Muslim and the Mongol and the Christians in the wake of the Crusades. One of his religious decrees, he stated unequivocally that jihad against the disbeliever is the most noble action. It is important to note that every scholar is the product of his environment, or every intellectual product is the product of the era where he lives. During Sukarno, Indonesians were inculcated or instructed to hate Malaysians as a new colonial forces. That was the era of Sukarno at one stage. We cannot use the environmental product, political environment during that time to be implemented today. Otherwise, Prime Minister Najib will not be in Indonesia today. So, what was the product of Ibn Taymiyyah logically cannot be implemented today, because the era of hostility between Muslim and Christians, between Muslim and Mongols, during the time of Ibn Taymiyyah, in which he produced intellectual output, in which he declares in his religious decree that jihad, fighting disbeliever, is the noble act, cannot be implemented and adhered to in today's harmonious, or at least in today's coexistence nature of relationship between Muslim and Christians. So Wahhabism, unquestionably one strain of Islamic thought and practice, and is found in and around the new fundamentalism. I go back to my previous statement that we have to differentiate between Islam and Islamic thought, between Islam, the Quran and the Sunnah, and the interpretation of those texts. The interpretation varies from those who have an extreme mind, philosophical mind, sophistic mind, linguistic mind, and accordingly produce intellectual product according to his inclination or her inclination. So Islamic thought, Islamic school of thought is not identical to Islam. Wahhabism is one of those school of thought. So it is a mistake to point to Wahhabism as Islam. Yes, it is one of the Islamic thought, one of the mazhab, and one of the interpretation of Islamic texts, and it was interpreted by the inspirator Ibn Taymiyyah during the time of hostility. In Christianity likewise, if you read Martin Luther books, you will find hatred, you will find bitterness against the Prophet Muhammad, against Islam, but it is only logical and understandable. because he was living during the time of the siege of Vienna by the Islamic Turks. He has to be harsh against the enemy. Sukarno was harsh against Malaysia because Sukarno looked at Malaysia as, during that time, quote unquote, in line with the policies of the colonial power. So we really have to understand history, understand the era of the intellectual product before we can give a judgmental statement against Islam or the school of thought. So, Wahhabism seeks to remove the multivarious reading of the Quran that evolved in the centuries after the Prophet. If you want to have a pure Islamic teaching, according to Wahhabism, you are to go back to the basic. Since there is no celebration of the Prophet Muhammad's birthday during the time of the Prophet, then such celebration is an innovation, and every innovation is misguiding. Everything misguided will end up in hell. That is the quotation, what the tradition of Wahhabism in every Friday prayers. Out of noble intention, out of sincerity, to prevent the teaching of Islam to be contaminated by alien culture. Very sincere, but we really have to be objective in giving judgment against or pro this school of thought. According to them, individuals were to be dealt with harshly. Local custom, laws, saints, or rituals, anything not found in a literal reading of the Quran, were to be abandoned as idolatry. The destruction of the statue of Buddha by the Taliban regime, is a clear manifestation of the Wahhabis' teaching. A wrong interpretation of statue. In Egypt, you find the Sphinx as a tourist attraction, but during the Taliban regime, they consider the statue of Buddha is something that has to be eliminated because that could lead to shirk, to association of God. This is a different interpretation. I think distancing violence from the heart of Islam is an essential point to emphasize, given that many Westerners equate Islam with certain terrorist acts. This is the mistake. You equate Islam and the Islamic thought, or the Islamic school of thought, or the Islamic interpretation. Having said that, one may argue, why do violent acts occur, such as the assassination of Sadat, the ambush of foreign tourists in Egypt, and the 9/11 tragedy, and many others? The answer is that the perpetrator of these crimes certainly believe about themselves that they are devout Muslims carrying out the will of God, and their actions are sanctioned by Islamic law. Certainly, The Islam of these terrorists does not do justice to the civilized and peace-loving part of other Islam. But it has to be recognized as one strand of Islam. Every religion, like a rope woven from many strands. Likewise, Christianity is of many components. The teaching of Jesus, the theology of Paul, the Neoplatonism of Augustine, the Constantine's conversion, the Crusades, the Inquisition, the piety of the Puritans, the Ku Klux Klans, and others. Within Christianity, there are several violent strands: persecuting Jews, attacking Muslims, declaring war against all manner of offender. During the Crusades, Christian warrior descended on the Holy Land to claim it for the church and to empty it of all infidels, Muslim and Jews. These are strands of Christianity. However, it is not fair to say religion is the driving force behind the violence of any particular radical religious movement. But it is fair to say that genuine and quite dangerous elements of religion, be it Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and others, have been appropriated to justify the wars or terrorist acts these groups are waging. It is not so much that religion is violent. It is that we are, human beings, are violent. Each religion has its militants and its own theological justification for the use of violence. Each religion preserves a canon of warrior narratives to draw upon when it feels itself concerned or the victim of injustice. Out of the multiple reading of the sacred text, it is the duty of religious leaders, it is the duty of the Institute here, and the intellectuals to pick the appropriate reading which can only lead to peaceful and harmonious relations among nations and not to incite emotion or ignite anger against one another. The impact of the internal factor, which I have just mentioned. Going back the quotation of Max Weber, the Protestantism and the spirit of capitalism, meaning that the concept, the doctrine of Calvinism led to the emergence of the spirit of capitalism. Because of religious concept, because of religious doctrine, because of a rigid understanding of Wahhabism led to the terrorist act. And therefore, it is our duty to spread around the religious concept of harmonious relationship. We have abundance of forces, traditions, which could lead us to have a peaceful coexistence, harmonious relationship, friendly interactions between all religious adherents. So, concept, religious doctrine is very instrumental in shaping the societal behavior, in shaping the attitude of the adherents of the a particular religion. During the time of Calvin, his doctrine is that a successful person on earth is an indication of a successful life hereafter. What does make this doctrine change the behavior of the Westerner, the Protestant? Everyone wants to be successful. The doctor wants to be successful, the merchant. Every profession wants to be successful. And successful life led to the emergence of capitalism. Because of what? Because of doctrine. Because of religious doctrine of Calvinism. This is according to Max Weber in his book. So if we want to see in our region a peaceful Muslims with harmonious relation with other adherents, we really have to interpret abundance of verses in the Quran, the tradition of the Prophet, of harmonious relationship, and spread that doctrine among our youth for them to be part of the aim of Islam, meaning peace and peaceful relationship. So my quotation of Max Weber accentuate my thesis that whatever doctrine we have in this region would influence the religious adherents. Look at Pakistan today. It's much different of Pakistan of 15 years ago. Because of what? Because of doctrine. Wahhabism doctrine interpreted so rigidly that bring about the emergence of Taliban, Osama bin Laden. But this is not only the internal factor. The external factor also has to be addressed. And I think the Obama administration today is trying to remedy the external factor, try to be more or reach out Muslims, try to be objective in solving the Palestinian conflict. I think I still have many pages, but my time has up, and I would rather entertain your questions, if there is any, and continue later with discussion. Thank you for your patience. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you so much for your thought-provoking and comprehensive presentation. I will make only a few brief remarks, but then pass on to Professor Usman Bakar to lead the question and answer session. We heard our learned speaker to say that Islam does not teach or suggest violence in any way. And then again that attribution to Islam of violence is a great mistake. Islam's position is clearly stated in the Quran, and the verses were quoted in translation, and I might read it perhaps in the original version. وَمَنْ قَتَلَ نَفْسًا مُتَعَمِّدًا بِغَيْرِ حَقٍّ فَكَأَنَّمَا قَتَلَ النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا. One who destroys a life without a just cause is as if he has destroyed the entire people. And here the text says nafsan muta'ammidan, intentionally destroys an innocent life. And the nafs does not differentiate between the type of people, what color, what religion, what territory, and what status you are. It's absolutely aam in mutlaq. And then again, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا لِتَكُونُوا شُهَدَاءَ عَلَى النَّاسِ. I think the translation was read to us. We made you a midmost nation, a nation of moderation, so that you be a witness over the people. وَيَكُونُ الرَّسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا. And the messenger be a witness over you. The job of a witness is to stand for truth and to stand for moderation and balance. And the essence of wasatiyya is justice, to stand for that and act as witnesses and carry the message truthfully and honestly. In support of that, there is a hadith. One day the Prophet ﷺ asked the companions, "Should I inform you about something that merits greater?" then prayer and fasting in Hajj. And the companions were, of course, they said, "What is that, O Messenger of God?" And he said in reply, "It is Islah Zat al-Bayn," to bring harmony and agreement between two conflicting parties. That merits greater than the ritual performances of Islam. Here is an attention paid to the essence of spirituality and the values that Islam stands for. Unfortunately, we have become so much ritual and tend to forget about the spirit of our religion. I think that our history has had its ups and downs, but basically I think that we have lived through our history, whether it is Umayyads and Abbasids and Ottomans and other, a fairly peaceful stretch of history, that violence is not one of our attributes as such. But we are really sad to see September 11, Bali bombing and so on. Can we really agree with those people who act in the name of Islam and destroy lives in masses? Our learned speaker also explained the external and the internal factors. And the permission of jihad in the first 13 years of the message of the Prophet, the mission of the Prophet, jihad was not permitted. Violence was not permitted. During the persecution of Muslims in Mecca, the 12 years of the Prophet's mission, they were subject to violence, as you know, but they were not permitted to respond in the like manner. Only after the Prophet's migration to Medina, the Quranic verse came, أُذِنَ لِلَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ بِأَنَّهُمْ ظُلِمُوا. Permission is granted to those who fight because they have been wronged. They were thrown off their places and they have been attacked. This is another requirement of jihad, is that we have completely ignored and forgotten, is that jihad must begin with the declaration of the leader, the head of state, of the imam. This is the four mazhab are in agreement on this. But who has really observed this? You know, the jihadis and the takfir groups, they take the law into their own hands, leadership or no leadership. And I think that we see a great distance between pristine Islam and what the thoughts have developed after that. With these introductory remarks, may I invite my learned colleague, Professor Usman Bakar, to lead the question and answer session, please.
Okay, Professor Hashim, Dr. Alwi. Well, we have until 12 o'clock for question and answers. So the first question, yes.
Assalamu alaikum. It's not functioning. Yeah. Assalamu alaikum. Masoud Idris from MPH Publications. Thank you, Dr. Alwi. It was excellent talk, and you touched on so many issues that even if you want to ask questions, we have to make a new seminar, I guess, for that. But I will raise two issues here. You made clear distinction between Islam and Islamic thought, isn't it? Now, I have a little bit confusion here when you say Islam and Islamic thought, because you said Islam refers to religion and Islamic thought refers to interpretation of that religion by individuals, by people. Then when you interpret something, does that still remain Islamic? Or it is out of Islamic, is more, shouldn't we say that Muslim thought rather than Islamic thought? Because I have been experiencing this during my student years and when I was lecturing in the university, that there was a great confusion between usage of the terminologies when you say Islamic, Muslim, Islamic history or Muslim history, Islamic civilization or Muslim civilization. And because when we refer to the people, automatically in our mind is Muslim, is human being, because Muslim refers to human being, does not refer to the text, Quran itself. This has been problematic in my mind generally, and when we go back to the 20th century, this problem of Islam, Muslim occurred during the 20th century. Before that, you don't have much things like this. If you go to the Muslim historiography, all the books until the 19th century, I can say easily, none of them contains the term Islam in the book. It's always something else inside. But 20th century, the influence of Orientalism, and especially Muslims who studied in Oriental institutions, when they came back, they start using imported terminologies, what was introduced by the Orientalists. One of them was during the early 20th century was Mohammedanism, for instance, Mohammedans they were calling. Then later on it took different shape, Musliman, and then later on it took Islamist, and then now today, we are using so many terminologies. This was my first question. The other one is, you gave some examples from the history. Let's say when you were talking about the Wahhabism and you said that we have to go to study the environment of Ibn Taymiyyah, how he came up with this kind of ideas. But when you look to the Muslim world today, the curriculums, particularly in the Muslim world, we can talk about the whole world, but particularly in the Muslim world, when we look at their curriculum in their schools or higher educational centers, something like that, excluding primary schools, secondary school and university levels, usually the texts are prepared and they teach of whatness, howness, and whenness. They always avoid teaching whyness. And I think today the curriculums, should be reinterpreted or republished with the emphasis on the whyness of the cases, why it happened, why. And we have been always avoiding from whyness, and I have been experiencing, I have been even instructed in my teaching years, I have been instructed, don't touch on the issue of why too much. And I had to avoid from that, Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will let Dr. Alwi respond.
Immediately?
Yeah, after the question is a bit
okay.
loaded.
You can differentiate between varieties of interpretation. Sayyidina Ali ibn Abi Talib once was asked, what do you mean by Islam? Surely Islam is the Quran and the Sunnah, but hammalun lil wujuh, has many faces, many interpretations. Each interpretation surely try to understand the text according to the capacity of the interpreter. If a philosopher try to interpret the Quranic text, his inclination influence the outcome of his intellectual product, and therefore later scholars categorize or put categories on the interpretation of the Quran, whether it is tafsir falsafi, philosophical tafsir, or an interpreter who is knowledgeable about linguistic skill, then his tafsir is tafsir lughawi, from the perspective of the linguistic. Someone who is a jurist, his tafsir is tafsir al-ahkam, or legalistic view of the Quran. Now, of course, those interpretations are valid. We cannot say that they are wrong, but you are like to have many varieties with one source. When interpreter try to explain how to do the ablution, wudu, one school of thought would say that you have to wash your feet according to the Quran. According to his interpretation, that washing the feet is part of the wudu. Others would say it is only masr, meaning touch, according to his interpretation. You cannot say that those who say touch is wrong. Neither you say that those who say that you have to wash your feet is wrong. This is a variety of interpretation. Likewise, school of thought, Wahhabism has the dominant, or Ibn Taymiyyah dominant concern was the alien culture coming to community of Muslims. So he is addressing that alien culture, which could put a threat to the purity of Islam. So he put emphasis on rejecting all which could be harmful to the purity of Islam. For him, philosophy is not good, because philosophy was not there during the Prophet Muhammad. But you find Muslim philosophers like Al-Farabi, like Al-Kindi, like Ibn Rushd, and they are trying to philosophize the text by combining the rational aspect of philosophy and the spiritual aspect of Islam. So philosophy is needed. But for Ibn Taymiyyah, philosophy is a threat to the purity of Islam. Both are of sincerity. They are doing that out of sincerity, out of noble motivation. You cannot say that the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah are wrong. It was right during his time. Now, if someone criticizes Ibn Taymiyyah with arguments that today's world, we need more of accommodation, more of view of inclusivistic view, more of harmonious relation, more of respect, we find that also in the Quran. And therefore, in my presentation, it is the duty of the religious leaders, scholars, intellectuals, to take from the text what is relevant to our time, and therefore the Quran is valid for all time, because you can find reference of harmonious relationship between Christianity and Islam, between all other adherents. So Islamic thought, what I am objecting, that someone would say Islam is violent. Look, Ibn Taymiyyah says it is the most noble act is waging war against disbeliever. I would say no, that is not the case. Like Christianity, today so many Christian scholars are criticizing the church during the Crusades era. That was the time when one school of thought, one ideas, one interpretation was valid during that time, but not valid during our day. So Islam is the Quran and the Sunnah. Even the Sunnah, the tradition of the Prophet, cannot be equated to the Quran, because Quran is universally accepted by Muslims. But the Sunnah, you have the, hadith with all kind of categories, mutawatir, hasan, da'if, and so forth. You have to differentiate between the consensus hadith and those narrated by someone who is known to be, forgetful. So the authenticity of the hadith is, or the rating of the hadith is lower than the hadith which had been narrated by almost all companion of the Prophet. So school of thought is not Islam. It is part of Islam. So you can say, no, I don't like this school of thought. Today I can say, I don't like the interpretation of Wahhabism. I like the interpretation of Ibn Rushd. If you say Ibn Rushd is a part of Islam, it's right. But you are like going to the mall. You like Versace's brand, you like Agner brand, it is up to you. It is like you pick which one you feel comfortable. I feel comfortable when I travel not to wash my feet, because I know that this is part of the interpretation which is also valid. I feel comfortable if I travel not to, let's say, fast, because there is interpretation of that. So the West sometimes mistakenly look at one school of thought as Islam and generate that Islam is wrong. Look, the interpretation is Ibn Taymiyyah says this and that, and Wahhabism says this and that, so Islam is wrong. I can give you an interpretation of Islam which is very friendly, which is very accommodative, and therefore it is the duty of Muslim scholars to always revisit the ideas, not revisit the Quran, revisit the school of thought. The school of thought is a product of the era, is a product of the questions of the community. Then the scholar would answer, this is the answer. Even Abu Hanifa once said, because he was in Persian community, you are allowed not to recite the Fatiha in Arabic. He was then recount his idea, because he was answering the questions of the community. The community said, it is hard for us to pray and read the Fatiha. It is hard, so it is very difficult. So he said, now you can read the Fatiha without the Arabic text. But he realized that it was wrong, and then he corrected his ideas. So the scholars is a product of his environment. Today's environment, Islam should be interpreted in a peaceful interpretation to bring back the peaceful image of Islam, the positive, the bright image of Islam. Islam, what has been quoted from the Quran, never condones, support violence. Only in the case of, if you are treated unjustly, you can then wage war against those. Even there is a verse in the Quran, لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا إليهم. God never what لا ينهاكم never what forbid you to treat well to those non-Muslim who do not fight against you or expel you from your country. God never forbid you to be nice, to be wonderful, to be just, to be friends. This is Quran. So why should we fight against non-Muslims if they are friendly to us? So these kind of verses should be the verses of today. And again, the school of thought is not Islam, but is part of Islam, can be rejected because this is a product of human being. You can interpret if you feel that you have the knowledge to interpret the Quran. Okay? The second curriculum, I think today, even in Saudi Arabia, they realize the unintended consequences of the curriculum. And now they are trying to revise the curriculum, trying to be more accommodative to address the current issues. We want to be more friendly and also to be treated friendly by others. And therefore, curriculum, again, my thesis is religious concept, religious doctrine can shape the attitude, can shape the societal behavior of the community.
Right, because just on the second, Tengku, and the third one, Dato' Aziz.
Assalamualaikum, Dr. Alwi. I have one question and two short comments. The first question is, with Obama now president, what do you think the prospects are in Mindanao and Patani for a solution? Mindanao and Patani with Obama in power. And two comments. Regarding 911, I think there is a movement, well, I'm sure there's a movement now in the United States trying to relook at the perpetrators and the causes of 911 because there are certain reasons to think that it's more than just Al-Qaeda and the usual, perpetrators. And the second comment is, I noticed that in most talks about terrorism and extremism that I've been to, people would mention Muslim extremists, Christian extremists, sometimes Hindu extremists, but I've never actually heard about Judaic extremists in Israel or elsewhere. Judaic extremists, Judaism. They are actually a very powerful force. Of course, not all of them are extremists. For example, like the Nature Karta, they are quite okay. But Judaic extremists, they are hardly ever mentioned. I think most people are afraid to be labeled anti-Semitic. But this is something, there's a big gap in the picture. Thank you.
My question is, you have said good things about the purity of Islam. I've been watching some public debates quite recently in London, where Jonathan Sack came out very forcefully in the debate, and I think from the Christian group, I can't remember who, and also there was a Muslim. I can't help but notice in the articulation of the intellectual force from the Muslim is not that strong. So I'm just wondering, in the battle out there, battle of the mind, battle of the intellectual capacity, whether we've got the frontliners, to talk about Islam in its purity, in its philosophy, to be on par or at par with these other public intellectuals from the other communities. And if you read about Islam, it comes to mind is, people who are non-Muslims who are more articulate than us talking about Islam, as far as I see, in the market. People like Esposito, I think Dr. Osman is very, he knows him quite well. But you get people like Tariq Ramadan, once in a while coming out, and some of the people. There's still a need for us to come up with our frontliners in all the public domain, for us to articulate our stand. So I'm just wondering the methodology, as far as we're concerned, how to go about to prepare this in the battle out there. Thank you.
With regard to your first question about Fatani and Mindanao, I just cannot answer this question because we all hope that Obama administration can be more objective and can accommodate the cry of Muslims there and try to solve this problem. I think it is to the advantage of both the Thai government and the Filipino government to put an end to the strong opposition from the community. This touch, of course, the political aspect of it. The second is about extremists in Judaism. People were talking about this, especially during the assassination of, after the assassination of Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel. Again, it seems that your concern is also touch upon the concern of this, the distinguished gentleman afterwards, that there is no a strong articulation about Islam. I think in today's world, we need to have a strong media. Articulation may had happened and occurred everywhere, but if it is only in the, let's say in a small venue, not to be published, then nobody will know about it. So many discussions took place, but no media coverage. So we need to have a stronger media coverage. But for your information, I think after 9/11, we can take advantage of the curiosity of the Westerner about Islam. I noticed that by so many invitations, at least that's what I experienced, so many invitations for me to talk. And they want to listen from the first-hand information from Muslims. Even my Indonesian book, one of the university, intended to now in the process of translating it into English, because my book is titled Islam and the West. So people are curious to know Islam more after 9/11. It is our duty to try to introduce, present Islam as has not been presented in the past. And according to Norman Daniel, up till today, the mentality of the Middle Ages of hatred, anger, hostility to Islam still prevails in the mind of the Westerner. I have a personal experience when I taught Islam in number of universities in the United States. When I explained the biography of the Prophet, the students, after the course, admittedly said that, oh, your Prophet is not that bad. Meaning that they have a previous misconception. But after we present, not presenting it from the Muslim perspective, but from the historical perspective of others, they started to know, and this is the time. So it is up to us.
One more, is it? Have you the other question?
Please.
No, there was somebody behind Zaina and then Zaina. Who was that just now? Oh, he doesn't want to ask anymore. Okay, Zaina. No, Zaina. And then.
Be good if you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Zaina Anwar. I have a comment and a question. One was, you said in a response to a question that the problem is that the West cannot differentiate, or Westerners cannot differentiate between what is Islam and what is Islamic understanding, Islamic thought. I think it's not just the West, it's Muslims as well. And many, many Muslims, and especially politicized Muslims, and the ideology of political Islam also does not differentiate between what is Islam and the diversity of Islamic thought. And I think it is a strategy used by the political Islamists not to make that differentiation, that only their understanding and their idea of what constitutes Islam is the one single truth of Islam. And I think the person who came up to say that our use of terminology, I think we should start to use Muslim law, Muslim state, Muslim thought, because the minute you use the label Islam, everyone thinks, oh, this is revelation and God's words, and therefore it cannot be changed. My question is, your appeal to religious leaders and intellectuals to now promote a more harmonious, tolerant, inclusive understanding of Islam. I wonder if you feel that intellectuals, including yourself, and religious leaders are actually, or have actually been culpable in the Muslim community in the rise of radicalism and extremism within the Muslim community. Because I feel that in the past, only now, only post-September 11, that there is an awareness, to promote the kinder, inclusive vision of Islam that, of course, exists within our tradition. So do you feel that, I feel that many intellectuals and religious leaders have been silent during the past decades and allowed the extremist voices to be the dominant voice in the public space, in the debate on Islam. For whatever reason, because fear of being accused of being infidels, being anti-Islam, anti-Sharia, anti-God, all the usual accusations hurled at people who have a different point of view. That I think, that because of the silence of the intellectuals and the silence of the moderate voices in the years where political Islam and radical Islam rose, that has led us to where we are today. And I remember I was in Jakarta, in Yogyakarta, for about 2 weeks, meeting with the scholars in IAIS network and the Pesantren democracy activists and all that. And there was a huge contrast between the analysis of the women's groups in the rise of radical Islam in Indonesia and the analysis of the scholars, including Western scholars who study Indonesia, who were very blasé. And this is before September 11, before Bali bombings. The women's groups were already, their ears were all very worried already about what was going on in Indonesia with the Islamist groups. But not the scholars, not the men, not the human rights activists who were mostly men as well. They were not sensitive to the fact that there is change occurring on the ground that they should be worried about. It's only much later, after September 11, that that awareness and concern arose. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Alwi. My name is Shannon Shah. I'm a journalist. My question is related to Zaina's comment as well, because I was wondering, do you distinguish between Islamic radicalism and political Islam? Just to give an example, I think a lot of the victims, the casualties of violence and radicalism in the name of Islam are Muslims themselves. Just to take the focus away from 9/11 for a minute, for example, in Algeria, before the 90s, before 1992, I think, it was a group of fundamentalist Islamists who were trying to achieve the goal of an Islamic state through electoral means. But when the elections were cancelled, very quickly political Islam turned into radical Islam. There was a lot of violence involved, a lot of acts of terror involved, and a lot of the casualties were Muslim. But also there's an added layer of a very repressive and violent secular state in Algeria as well, a secular Muslim state. And I think a majority of Muslims who live in Muslim majority countries actually live under repressive secular Muslim regimes which co-opt doctrine, which co-opt Islamic doctrine to their advantage to maintain the status quo as well. So my question is, how do you view this? Where does doctrine play into this? What is the way out of this? Because, you know, on a practical level, it is Muslims as well who suffer at the hands of terror in the name of Islam. Thank you.
My name is Tan and I'm a journalist as well. I'd like to ask regarding what you mentioned about how Islamic law protects non-Muslims from tyrannical or tyrannical Muslim laws, such as the imposition of Islam on others. What are your views on governments within the region who have condoned or allowed forced conversions to Islam, for example, within Muslim and non-Muslim marriages, or from children within a marriage to Islam?
Thank you for all your very insightful questions. I think diversity of Islam, or diversity of Islamic thought, and why the extremist voices are heard more than the moderate voices. I have two answers to this. First, those who are moderate, they are not going to be seen as moderate in terms of the claim of the extremists that the West are unjust toward Muslims. Because if this argument emerge and some radical Muslims or extremists would always pointing fingers to the West being unjust to Muslims, even the moderate cannot but agree on that. And therefore the media, the second portion of the answer is, the media likes to exaggerate and likes to cover all those kind of protests or radicalism, because this is the news. But the moderate voice or voices are not attractive to people. You know, one person protesting the US at the embassy is considered good news for the media, but not, let's say, 10 people trying to help others in a way that Islam is encouraging doing that, to be part of media's coverage. So media is very important. And again, as I mentioned earlier, so many moderate voices are not covered by the media, because this is not considered good news for the commercial purposes. The good news is what is against the norm. Now the reality in Indonesia, even though people are worried about extremism, radicalism in Indonesia, but the reality in the Indonesian political outcome, the election, Muslim or Islamic parties are not showing good result. The secular parties are showing best result. And that is the real and the objective condition of Indonesia. The radicals are voicing their concern, but not accepted by the silent majority of Indonesians. The media always like to exaggerate. So if talking about Indonesia, I don't think that the radical Muslims are gaining ground, contrary to that. Because this is the will of the people who voted for the Islamic parties, and today Islamic parties are suffering losses, but the secular parties are the dominant. The secular parties headed by Muslims and devout Muslims. Take Democrat presidents, a good Muslim. Take Golkar, he is from NU, Nahdlatul Ulama, even part of the ulama community. Take what else? Yeah, Gerindra, and those are military, but you know Hanura, the wife of the head of Hanura, is better off for the radical than my wife, because the wife is putting scarf. My wife does not. Even though I'm so-called Muslim scholar. But you know, again, General Wiranto's wife is putting scarf. So we have to have a good media. Surely this is an Islamic country. You can get a better coverage outside Islamic country. Outside the Muslim community, the media coverage will always put Islam and Muslim as the wrong side of the world. So the extremists, the violent, and all kind of vice. So still your appeal to have the moderate voice be heard, we are grateful that we have an institute here. And I think this is a place where moderate voices can also be spread around. Political Islam and Islamic radicalism, you know, the Hamas democracy and Algiers democracy was destroyed by the, let's say, by the perception of the West that those who won the elections are radicals, are extremists, so democracy is not compatible with those people. That is the double standard of the West, which I mentioned in my presentation, that radicalism not only came out because of religious perspective, but also because the West is always supporting the regime abhorred by the people. So where to go? They don't have any layout except voicing their concern, sometimes by demonstration. And again, terrorism emerged because of the injustice felt by the people, and that is the consequences of, you can't say that political Islam or political Muslim took over the ideas of radical Muslim. No, they have to do that because they feel that they are being mistreated or treated unjustly. So under repressive government, sometimes radicalism also emerge. You can find that in Egypt, let's say. You find political Islam or Ikhwanul Muslimin, because their voices are always suppressed by the regime. Meanwhile, the West is behind the regime in which the people are sometimes deprived from expressing their political aspirations. Forced conversion, I don't really see any such phenomenon in Indonesia today. Actually, Muslims are crying for the sometimes malpractices of the Christian mission, but today I think we are not very much concerned about forced conversion either from Christianity to Islam or from Islam to Christianity. I don't know whether or not you have an isolated incident or happening in Indonesia, but in Indonesia we are proud to be a nation of respectful to other religious adherents, and the government as well as the community, religious as well as political, are trying their best to be as harmonious as they can to one another in terms of religious tolerance. Surely there must be an isolated incident which is not or cannot be considered as a norm, but as an exception.
Sorry, you want to?
Yes, maybe I'll make
yes,
a
please.
comment, if I may. Perhaps I can make a brief comment on 2 points. One, that there is not a strong articulation of Islam. I think in that connection, I would say yes, we have not created a new mazhab, but we have, to my understanding, we have done that deliberately. In 20th century, there has been a movement to move away from the mazhabi divisions and to speak of Islam, the broader Islam. I think that there are among us living contemporary scholars who have written books in the order of 100 books, like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, like Sayyid Hussain Nasr. I might have said, I can say I have written 20 books, my little contribution. There are many, many articulations of Islam, and they consist of bringing Islam closer to the realities of our age. But whether we need that to create a new mazhab, I'm not quite sure of that. The other point is how Islam protects non-Muslims. In the idea of forced conversion, perhaps this is a more local question, and I thought I might respond to that. How Islam protects non-Muslim when it comes to the idea of basic rights, like protection of life, of property, freedoms, freedom of movement, of trade, and so on. Islam does not differentiate between Muslim and non-Muslim. As a citizen, all our justice is not a prerogative in a Muslim community of Muslims. No, it is for all. So the basic rights are for everyone. In the area of freedom of religion, some questions and difficulties exist in our society here, and once again the scenario, as our learned speaker reflected on the Indonesian situation, they have moved away from that. If you ask me the question, in my humble opinion, forced conversion is un-Islamic. And those who use Islam in order to inflict, for example, or to for purposes that are not germane to the spirituality or aqidah of religion, but for other purposes, whether it is marriage, whether it is divorce, whether it is custody, and there is a tussle between the wives, one and husband, one has become a Muslim, the other non-Muslim, and the fight is over children, and the husband goes to the Sharia court or something and claims that the children, maybe 2 years old or 3 years old, has been converted to Islam. What does it mean? You convert a 2-year child to Islam or 5-year-old child to Islam? It doesn't really make sense when you look at this phenomena from the text and guidelines of Islam. Islam consists of Iman that is a very deliberate affirmation. Iqrarun bil lisan wa tasdeequn bil qalb. Profession in your words and affirmation in your heart. Can you expect a child of 5 years? And most of these forced conversions really arise over those issues. I think that we ought to depart from that. I think that perhaps those are the comments that I wanted to make.
I hope, Dr. Ali, if you don't mind if I just extend the last round, just 2 more questions. Fadullah just now, and then the last. That's all. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum. I just have one question to our learned speaker. Islam has always been known in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, as the tolerant form of Islam. Tolerant form of Islam. And NU in Indonesia and the pesantren could live with Nasakom. So, you know, it's been a very tolerant understanding of Islam all over. Where is the source of this sort of fundamentalism? Because looking at Islamic history, if you see the downfall of Muslim in Spain, it arose partly because fundamentalism, both from the Christian side and from the Muslim side, unwillingness to live with contradictions. My Muhammadiyah friends in Indonesia, you know, they're against some of Javanese traditional customs, which basically are related to Islam in any case. So where does this overemphasis on this rigid, inflexible understanding of Islam come from? In the pesantrens and in the understanding of Islam. In Malaysia today, my daughter was absolutely shocked when she went to this marriage course, which is obligatory, and then the ustaz is teaching how to beat your wife when she's pregnant. Yes, it's absolutely ridiculous. So how do we, you know, this negative, fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, I think, where does it come from? How do we get over this and return to the tolerant understanding of Islam that we had in the past? Where is the movement among Muslims against the death penalty? Surely the death penalty has seen its age. It's no longer relevant. Where are we moving in? Are we moving in that direction? Because we seem to think that Islam can only be implemented by force. That's not how Islam spread in Malaya. That's not how Islam spread in Java. But now it seems to be that we can only spread Islam by force. Where does this come from? And how, that's not the most important question. How do we overcome this problem of this sort of trying to implement Islam by force? And it arises also, why is it that we're starting to hate other people? You know, the easiest emotion, of course, is to arouse the emotion of hate in others. How can we, as Muslims, push this down? People are going to be unjust, and people have been unjust all over the world. But if the Muslims in Baghdad had showed the whole city of Baghdad was destroyed, the people were destroyed, but the Mughals became Muslims. And it wasn't by inciting hate against the Mughals that they became a Muslim. So how can we, this is, I think, is what I see as is Islamic tradition. So how can we overcome this sort of thing, and how can we return as Muslims to this more tolerant understanding of Islam? Thank you.
Okay, last one.
Assalamualaikum, Bapak Professor. My name is Said Akbar. Can I take this off? Just to follow up on the points made by the previous questioners and also Sister Zaina. First of all, I want to congratulate the professor because in this talk that we had, you quoted the Quran. You quoted the Quran. You quoted Surah Baqarah, verse 144. From my experience, I take opportunity to attend as many Islamic talks. We hardly quote the Quran. My view is we don't really follow the Quran. It's ignored. That is why we have all these problems. So I would strongly advise the Muslims, the scholars, to encourage Muslims to go back to the Quran, refer to the Quran first, and see what the Quran says. For example, the issue on definition, someone brought up the issue earlier, and the sister mentioned that we should call ourselves Muslims. Forgive my Arabic, but I think the Quran says, Huwa sammakumul muslimin. It is God who has named you Muslims. So that is a name given to us already. There's no dispute about that. And the Quran also says, Inna ladina indallahi al-Islam. The only deen accepted by God is Islam. Now, the word is deen, which is a way of life, which I think we need to focus more on Islam as a way of life. The discussion here mostly is centering on the religious aspect. This is where we are having a lot of problems, differences, when it becomes too religious. But the word is deen. Inna ad-deena indallahi al-Islam. And you mentioned earlier, Professor, that Islam means peace, salam. Yes, and in Baqarah, I think where God commands the Prophet Abraham, he says, Aslimu, which means submit yourself. And Abraham replies, Aslamtu illahi rabbil alameen, which means I submit myself to God. So I think if the focus is more on Islam as a way of life, a deen, rather than all this talk of mazhab and all these interpretations, we are going to have a serious, never-ending conflict and arguments forever. I'm surprised, after 1,400 years, the question is arising, what is Muslim, Musalman, and things like this, you see. So I would encourage that we try to go back to the original source, the Quran, and maybe that should help us. Having said that, my real point is about Indonesia and Pakistan. I hope you just give me a little bit of time. You mentioned the issue of President Sukarno, where he was very angry with Malaysia. I studied a bit of Indonesian history, just to inform you that after the war ended, Second World War, Sukarno declared independence for Indonesia from the Dutch. At that time, the Dutch, Holland was destroyed. There was practically no Holland. So the Dutch asked the British to help take back Indonesia. So what the British did was, Indonesia, of course, the Japanese army was still in Indonesia. So the British, they released the Japanese prisoners of war, gave them weapons, and used the Japanese army in Indonesia to hold Indonesia for the Dutch. And the British army bombed Indonesia from Malaysia, from here, from Malacca and Singapore and Penang, including the massacre of Bandung, where they killed about 3,000 people. So all this was in the memory of Sukarno when he came out with the idea of Gangneung, Malaysia, just for your note. Yeah. My last point is about Pakistan. Right now in Pakistan, there is something going on which I think the Muslims are not focusing, what is happening in the Swat Valley and what you said about the influence of Wahhabism. In my view, there is an attempt, surprisingly, this is under the President Obama. Yesterday, there was a bomb attack. The Predator aircraft shot a missile and killed a few people. And this is of little or no strategic value to the Americans to bomb the Swat Valley. But they're doing it under President Obama, when he has declared that they are going to pull out from Iraq and Afghanistan over the next 18 months. If you're going to pull out of Afghanistan, why do you bomb the so-called Taliban in the Swat Valley? My view is that there is an attempt to destabilize this country, And the army in Pakistan is mostly Punjabis, but the Swat Valley is mostly the Pashtuns and the people of the north, the different tribes. So there is, to me, the real target in Pakistan is to destabilize the army. And there are Wahhabi influence, very strong Wahhabi influence, not just in the Swat Valley, but also within the Pakistani army, who do not like what is happening in Pakistan, where the US Air Force is bombing Pakistan at will. So we have to keep a close eye on Pakistan. I do believe that in the next 2 or 3 years, this problem is going to escalate. And we're going to be talking about Pakistan for the next 5 years, 10 years, unless the Muslims wake up and forget about all these religious differences and go on a nationalistic basis. Perhaps it's time the Muslims should consider nationalism. We must love our country, our neighbors, and overlook religious differences. And I feel that what I said earlier, if we go back to the original source of upholding the Quran, we may be able to overcome these differences and withstand the enemies better. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and then you give. With regard to your question, where does this come from? I think the second speaker addressed this. You know, again, the doctrine, the concept, influence, attitude. You can differentiate between someone who is raised in an environment of tolerance and raised in an environment of hostility. Likewise, the upbringing, the education. So if you are educated in an atmosphere of accepting diversity, then you will become more tolerant. If you are raised in an environment of a single interpretation, then you will become someone who would ignore others and have an inclination of being self-righteous. It reminds me to my professor in Cairo when I was there writing my dissertation. I asked him, what is your next book? He said, I'm writing about Ibn Taymiyyah. I said, oh, Ibn Taymiyyah, you are a philosopher. He said, yes, because I'm applying for a job in Saudi Arabia. You see, so even a professor care for the welfare of his family, and it does not mean that he sells his principles, but he has to adapt with the environment where he is going to reach his objective. So the radicalism came because of, again, in my view, I still stick on those two factors. The doctrine. We used to send our students long time ago, before Wahhabism emerged and flourished in Saudi Arabia, before the pact, during the time of the Hashemite. You remember all of our scholars graduated from Saudi Arabia, became the founder of Nahdlatul Ulama. Nahdlatul Ulama is a moderate version of Islam, accepting the local custom, contrary to the Muhammadiyah. Muhammadiyah, you mentioned that they don't like the local custom and brand them as innovative in religious ritual, meaning we have to abandon. You know, the reformist movement in the Islamic world has these two kind of inclination. Some is very rigid. I explained that. Muhammadiyah is more tolerant of the rigid faction. More tolerant of the rigid faction. In Indonesia, we have Persis. Persis is very much in line with rigid Wahhabis. Today in Saudi Arabia, the moderate Wahhabis are emerging. So many Saudi scholars are put aside by the royal family because they are preaching what was seen as promoting radicalism. Today, if you follow the news in Saudi Arabia, the change of curriculum, the change of mindset, this is because that they were not aware of the unintended consequences of this kind of doctrine. They were sincere. They want to purify Islam. They want to go back to the basic, only to the Quran. But by going to the basic, you have to interpret the basic. It reminds me when Foreign Minister of Portugal came to me when I was Foreign Minister. He said, I know many Muslims and I started to learn about Islam. But unfortunately, it confuses me more before I read the Quran. I went to the basic. I want to know Islam from the Quran. I said, it is wrong, because you read the Quran without the tafsir, the interpretation, you will get lost. You need to have an interpretation. When the Quran did not mention about how many times you go for prayer and how many rak'ah you are doing, you need the sunnah. And the sunnah is the source of, not controversy, the source of diversity. Even the Quran, Sayyidina Ali, as I mentioned, said, Quran has many wujuh, many faces, meaning it has an interpretation. The most reliable interpretation of the Quran is the Sunnah, is the Prophet's attitude, the Prophet endorsement, the Prophet behavior, the Prophet akhlaq. So going back to the Quran does not mean you eliminate the interpretation. So with respect to the second speaker, that we go back to the Quran. Now when you said, okay, we go back to ad-din al-Islam, you go to the tafsir, so many interpretation of Islam there. Is it Islam the religion? Is it Islam the attitude, surrender? If you are talking about surrender, then Islam is belongs to others as well, because I surrender myself to God. Ask the Christians, ask the Jews. They would say, I'm Muslims because I surrender my life. Salati wa nusuki wa mahyaya wa mamati lillahi rabbil alamin. The same thing. And therefore, then the others would say, no, Islam means Islam which brought by the Prophet Muhammad. Then started the interpretation again. So you cannot dissolve the text from the interpretation. Then I told the Foreign Minister of Portugal, I give you the a book written by Western about Islam. You will understand Islam more clearly than you read the Quran. You will get lost if you read the Quran. He said, yeah, it confuses me. I just cannot understand the translation. Cannot understand the translation. Yes, the Quran sometimes not too clear to be understood only by the explanation of the Prophet. So going back to the basic is very noble. You go to all scholars, you ask him, are you referring to the Quran or this is out of your mind? He would say, I'm referring to the Quran. going to basic. But this is my interpretation. And human being cannot be but to interpret, to give expression, articulation about what he think about Islam. So going back to Islam create school of thought, diversity of interpretation. So we are not quarreling, and therefore I always say, whoever feel comfortable with one interpretation, take it, but never say the others are wrong. Because we cannot say the others are wrong. This is the prerogative right of God. So going back to the Quran is good, and to the Sunnah, of course. But, you know, you mentioned about self-righteousness. In Indonesia, you can differentiate between students of Islamic university and students of secular university. Most of the so-called zealot, and you know, I don't like to put name radical, but very, very Islamic, with beard and those kind of Islam, came from secular university. Why? Because they just started to know Islam. And once they get one Islam from one scholar, they think that the others are wrong. And they are trying to so strongly in that line. And therefore, it is easy from this part of community of students to say that the other Islam is wrong. But not the Muslim students. The Muslim students have been trained to accept diversity of Islam. So they are more tolerant. And you can see that differentiation. So I think going back to the Quran is right and is very, very much of noble efforts, but going back without resorting to interpretation, we get lost. Thank you.
I think after the comprehensive, the learned answers to questions, there is no room for me to come and explain anything, really. But the learned speaker asked me to make maybe later a comment, but I think he answered the question. I wanted to just make a brief point. When you go back to the Quran, that is really what is moving closer to Islam. But interpret the Quran with moderation, because the Quran tells us, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. You must, if you are an ummah, a group of people that stand for moderation, you must also interpret the Quran in that spirit. I think that I originally come from Afghanistan, not far from the area where that this morning in New Straits Times there was a picture of a Pashtun leader who had actually said that we will protect Osama Laden. We will protect him as our brother. Why does he say that? I know the spirit of the Pashtuns when they speak. This was an expression of anger over these drone attacks, the American bombardment. What do we expect but extremism? If you have suffered that kind of attack, that is not really, they don't know the exact explanation. A child who is born in Palestine, and he is seen nothing but attacks in violence and bombardment, and then he might have been the one whose home was bulldozed by the Israelis. That child has grown in that environment, and you can hardly expect. A lot of those people are the ones who volunteer to be suicide bombers. I think that The external explanation may be that, but the internal explanation why people have become so extremist, as it was asked, I think it starts with this, the kind of spread of dictatorship in the Middle East, the military coup d'etats, departure from the basics of all teachings. And that actually started in Takfir and Hijrah in Egypt, started with that note, rejection of the mutlaqiyya, the despotic government. And I think that this has been developing Islamic revivalism and resurgence, started with that note, but it widened and it was sort of exacerbated by the external development. By the 1990s, we were approaching a kind of understanding that the middle grounds of Islam, the moderate majority, they were about to take the stage from these fundamentalists, because they felt that they have spoken for 30, 35 years attacking governments, but they have not offered an alternative, a credible alternative. And we were really kind of seeing some development that the moderate Islam will come to the fore, and then come 9/11, and then come others, and the jihadists are back to the center stage. So there are these dynamics, both internal and external. But I would say, in my own opinion, that we have to put our own house in order. Earlier it was said that the greatest victim of this violence are the Muslims themselves. If you count numbers, this extremism in violence and so on has destroyed the lives of more Muslims than they have done of any other people. So we need to really look into our own house and put it in order if we expect others to really sort of respect our views and our standing. With these comments, I would like to thank profusely and most warmly our learned speaker. In fact, I have learned so much from his presence. As a person of great experience and scholarship in the questions and answers, the presentation, it was enjoyable for me to be here, and I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you.